warum sich zu Millionen hier vereinigen, einmal symbolisch zum Ausdruck bringen in den Divisionen und Regimentern und nicht in den Kanonen und Panzern liegt, sondern dass die größte Stärke für
It is beyond belief now. It was beyond belief then. This monstrous tyranny to enslave mankind.
in der inneren Geschlossenheit eines Volkes, im idealistischen Glauben eines Volkes, das
This was Hitler's way to unify Europe, indeed the world, under one master race for which the weak must slave and the unworthy be exterminated. Liberal, socialist, freethinker, Democrat, Aryan or non-Aryan, whether French, Dutch, Belgian, Polish, Scandinavian, Russian or Anglo-Saxon, this was your end, if your face or your faith did not fit. This was the sewer and the cleansing of that sewer from which our modern Europe had to evolve. (1945). The war to end the tyranny was, like all wars, appallingly destructive. Then, as Western and Eastern armies neared each other across defeated Germany, the field radios crackled in English and Russian, louder, louder, until at last they met on the banks of the Elbe. There, democracy from the West and communism from the East rejoiced and shook hands. For now, our Europe was once again a place fit to live in. Now it was up to us, through ourselves and our leaders, to make that Europe not just a place fit to live in, but one to be proud of. So began the first of Europe's peacetime sittings to put a continent to rights. In Western Europe, where destruction had been comparatively light, life resumed some semblance of bruised normality. There, regimentation had been accepted only for the duration. But now regimentation was something to be done away with as soon as possible, in the good old-fashioned way. I disagree with every word you say, but I defend to the death your right to say it. Elsewhere, however, much had gone forever, with nothing to replace it. In the aftermath, but mere existence, where an undamaged roof made a palace, a loaf of bread, a banquet. Degradation, the end of self-respect, a harking back to the jungle. Here was only a numbness, almost a political vacuum. Yet even amid all the appalling problems and the struggle for a vestige of normality, there were some who could look ahead beyond the immediate, beyond the ruins, to tangible, practical goals. At a conference at The Hague, a United Europe movement, symbolized by the letter E, gave expression to aspirations, hopes, and possible leads.
It is not a movement of parties, but a movement of people. It must be all for all. Europe can only be united by the heartfelt wish and vehement expression of the great majority of all the peoples, in all the parties, in all the freedom-loving countries, no matter where they dwell or how they vote.
A united Europe, the dream of Charlemagne, and still a dream. Everywhere the crumbling monuments to suspicion, jealousy, and fear. Even the old Rhine herself, still a rampart between neighbors, her banks sown with forts and dragon's teeth. Sometimes a frontier was, like the Rhine, a natural barrier, But more often than not, it was merely an invisible line across fields and streets. An invisible line and an attitude of mind. How could these Europeans be united when they were all so different? Here was the blood of many races, nationalities, each with its own traditions and ways of life, not to mention a score of different tongues. As neighbors, they had seemingly little in common. And now they had not only little in common, but little enough anyway. All very well for Winston Churchill to make speeches on unity in 1947. He had self-respect, enough to eat, and a place in which to live. Unity was well down on the list of priorities. Anyway, it was supposed to stem from the United Nations. There, where delegates from East and West sat down together, even they were cynical about the chances. For though each side talked of a settled world, they were talking about neither the same thing nor the same means of achieving it. Now there was a new power in the world, that of the Soviet Union, based upon Moscow. Now, after 20 years of communism and 4 of battle against Hitlerite Germany, Russia, in a new garb, was emerging onto the world stage as a major force, employing new and disconcerting techniques. Life progresses upon the ideas of men, among them Marx and Lenin. But when ideas must be imposed, well, to those who cherish freedom, even the ideas themselves become suspect. In recent years, the Soviets have striven to efface from the records and monuments of communism the name of Joseph Stalin. But until his death in 1953, Soviet policy was made by Stalin and dictated by him. The annexation of the Baltic states, the huge advances of the Red Armies, had placed vast areas of Eastern Europe under Soviet control. There, in countries such as Poland, Stalin, in signing the peace treaties, had promised his allies to hold free elections. In the virtual political vacuum, with no other parties with any organization worth considering, it was hardly surprising that the communists swept the board. They had the full support of the occupying Red Army, and their pressure was relentless. Here, Moscow plays host to another of the series of post-war meetings of foreign ministers of the 4 powers: Russia, Britain, France, and the United States. The aim, to complete the peacemaking, and in particular to solve the problem of a divided and occupied Germany. Smiles, flowers for Britain's Ernest Bevin.
Very glad to be back in Moscow again. We shall spend the days ahead of us in trying to make a sound peace which will prevent any future aggression and let the whole world live in security.
In her new role of a sophisticated Western power, Russia laid on all facilities for the press of 2 hemispheres. The world must know that this was to be give and take, a hammering out, satisfaction emerging from around the table. Though difficulties abounded, for the diplomats of the West, there was endless patience and hope. For America's Mr. Marshall, talk long enough and surely the answers must come. For France's Monsieur Bidot, only slowly did he realize that there were not going to be any answers. For Britain's Ernest Bevin, only at long last did he come to see that his dream of a sound peace in Europe was to be permanently blocked by Russian stonewalling. Meanwhile, Soviet pressure continued. Greece was not occupied by the Red Army. Yet there the communists were strong enough to stage open civil war. A desperate struggle in which the government only kept control with help from outside. and already war-impoverished people were brought to the very limits of hunger and despair. But for these, war and politics were not the only causes. Look into the slums of Europe, and one was forced to realize that the real problems stemmed not only from the ravages of war or political strife, but also from the neglect of centuries. To save Europe from the Nazis, millions had died. To save a Europe still plagued by malaria, tuberculosis, rickets, and every other disease that comes with bad housing and malnutrition. To save a Europe, much of it not fit for pigs to live in. Is this what they had died for? In Normandy, at Alamein, in Stalingrad, in the hills of Italy and the streets of Paris? Was this the aftermath they had envisaged? What a heritage. What a Europe. In Washington, George C. Marshall made known the principles of the plan that was to bear his name.
The whole situation is critical in the extreme. But there's no doubt whatever in my mind that if we decide to do this thing, we can do it successfully. And there's also no doubt.
A plan whereby Europe could help itself by using American dollars as a catalyst between its own seriously degraded currencies. In Europe, the response was immediate. Statesmen met to examine the plan. Among them, Russia's Mr. Molotov. But when Mr. Molotov became aware of the vast scope of the plan, out he stalked. In Moscow, Mr. Molotov's attitude was fully supportive. Russia, though powerful, was still too war-ravaged to give much aid herself. Indeed, in these post-war conditions, only one country, the United States, had the available resources. The scheme was a generous, heartfelt response to crying human need, and in Europe it was welcomed as such. But for the Soviets, their creed was revolution first, rehabilitation afterwards. If people were starving, it was the fault of capitalists. Turn to communism, and then communism would provide the answers. But in Western Europe, the answer was yes. A few months later, Britain's Ernest Bevin reports progress.
On June the 5th of last year, Mr. Marshall gave our governments and people a new stimulus of self-help through mutual help. We in Europe prepared a statement of our pledges and our needs. The United States government and Congress responded to these needs and passed with generous speed legislation designed to meet them. We in our turn have now put our pledges into solemn obligations and have devised an organization to help, not only to administer American aid, but also to bring about a permanent, sound European economy.
The Organization for European Economic Cooperation. By its agreement, for instance, Holland could import 3/4 of the cotton needed to keep her textile looms in full production. Thus could Britain receive the carbon black she needed to make the tires for her vital automobile industry. Then there were tractors and other equipment for countries such as Turkey to bring their agriculture into line with that of their more fortunate neighbors. Steel for the shipyards of Trieste, Genoa, and Naples. And so the cargoes began to move across the Atlantic. Food, grain, raw materials. And it wasn't only a matter of feeding the hungry, of a temporary handout. From Chicago, Illinois to Douai, France, a giant press for steel production, not only to put French mills back on their feet, but also to make them among the most modern. Truly, the power of the New World had come to redress the balance of the old. Then, with Marshall Aid funds and technical assistance, Vast areas of Italy, whole islands such as Sardinia and Cyprus, became battlegrounds in a fight against the malarial mosquito. Everywhere, health teams went to grapple with the scourges of centuries. A new hope for Europe was read in the eyes of children. The opposition, however, did not read it that way. They claimed that the Marshall Plan was but a scheme to gain control of Europe and feather the nests of capitalists. Stalin realized that once countries had recovered, communism would lose its first emotional appeal to the hungry and the have-nots. Now time was no longer on his side, and pressure had to be redoubled. It was next felt in Czechoslovakia. The founder of this state, back in 1919, had been the veteran Thomas Masaryk. Now his son, Jan Masaryk, carried on his father's democratic tradition in collaboration with President Beneš. The intensely active Czech Communist Party, holding key positions in the government, naturally did their best to swing the country's foreign policy towards the Soviet Union. With their members went Foreign Minister Jan Masaryk to Moscow to discuss his country's acceptance of Marshall aid, only to receive a most emphatic no. And Russia was too powerful a neighbor to cross. Then, in Prague itself, the pressure mounted still further. At first, the communists had treated President Beneš with the respect he deserved as head of state. But he was, like Masaryk, held to be too pro-Western. Drastic measures were called for. By a coup d'etat, the Communist Party took control of the Czech state. In the once democratic parliament, the new leaders made their debut. President Beneš was forced to retire and soon died broken-hearted in virtual exile. After the rejoicing of their first day in power, the new leaders took time off to stand in silence to pay homage to an absent member of the House. For Jan Masaryk now lay in state after a fall to his death from a window. By accident, suicide, or murder, nobody then knew. This was Europe after but a few short years of peace. A democratic Western state, Czechoslovakia, had gone behind the Iron Curtain. Could any state now consider itself safe? And so they read that, alarmed by the general situation, statesmen of Western Europe had come together to face facts. The place, Brussels, with memories only too close to that other field of crisis, Waterloo. Only 5 nations signed the Brussels Treaty, but as a peacetime commitment to resist further encroachment, it was an historic step. The treaty brought tried and tested warriors to Fontainebleau, France, to make the first tentative plans for collective security, for meeting, if need be, force with force. But where was the force? At the end of the war, the Western Allies had rapidly demobilized. Soviet Russia had maintained its forces practically on a war footing. The power of the Red Army was formidable indeed. The next point of tension, Berlin. The whole of Germany and the city of Berlin had, after the war, been divided into 4 zones of occupation: British, French, American, and Russian. But the Soviets soon established, without the consent of their allies, a separate East German state, claiming Berlin as its capital. Ulbricht's government and his Russian sponsors didn't want just that part of the city which they occupied. They wanted all of it, without waiting for the peace treaty. In August, barely 5 months after the coup d'etat in Prague, the Russians unilaterally decided to isolate Western Berlin and cut its supply routes which crossed the Soviet zone of Germany. Trains, barges, and road traffic was stopped. The alternatives before the West were to leave Berlin ignominiously, or stay and allow the people within the British, French, and American sectors to starve. The only way in, the sky above. Was it conceivable that so large a city could be supplied by air? The West were responsible for almost 2.5 million people. And to supply a city of this size would mean mounting the biggest airlift of all time, bigger even than anything achieved during the war. The three Allied governments of the West decided to try. By so doing, they were taking a calculated risk, for if any one plane had been fired on, we would almost certainly have been at war again. From bases in England, France, and the American zone of Germany, the first planes began to arrive. Stalin remained confident. He assumed that within a matter of weeks, and certainly when winter came, the West would abandon the attempt. His optimism was not unfounded. Snow and fog made flying increasingly dangerous. 36 Allied planes were lost. Shortage of fuel brought Berlin factories to a standstill. But there was no stopping now. Week after week, in the winter of 48-49, the amount flown into the beleaguered city increased. By April 49, it had reached the staggering total of 12,000 tons a day, and the life of Western Berlin was literally maintained by air. In the face of Soviet pressure, the security of the West was established. The policy of standing firm was vindicated. Was this peace? Was this what they had died for? In Normandy, at Alamein, in Stalingrad, in the hills of Italy and the streets of Paris? So, in April 1949, with the Russians still blockading Berlin, 12 nations came together in Washington to sign the North Atlantic Treaty. Thus was born the Atlantic Alliance and NATO, its organization for the defense of the West, the beginnings of a true system of collective security. Realizing that the treaty brought the United States firmly onto the European scene for the first time in peacetime, the communists reacted, to say the least, unfavorably. Yet, by and large, Western Europe took this move towards defensive rearmament very soberly. And in spite of communist threats and propaganda, when NATO's first Supreme Commander, Dwight D. Eisenhower, arrived in Paris to take his post, the planned demonstrations came to naught. In a temporary headquarters, the military staff of the Alliance began their task of building a continent's defenses. Soldiers of many nations, working together in peacetime, because those nations realized that to avert war, the safest thing was to be prepared for it. So into Europe's ports came the first weapons to help restore the military balance. And as well as the armaments, men, soldiers, sailors, and airmen from across the Atlantic, from Canada and the United States, here at this time to prevent the guns from sounding. And with the camps and airfields mushrooming on the landscape, there was much else growing besides. The nations receiving Marshall Aid dollars were putting their own currency, freed by those dollars, to good work. Roads, railways, bridges, dams, hydroelectric schemes, everywhere the rattle of cranes and concrete mixers. And in the factories from Turin to Aberdeen, there was ever-growing roar and bustle. The Marshall Plan was the stimulant, NATO was the shield. In the Rhineland city of Bonn, workers put finishing touches to a new Parliament House, the seat of government for the new Federal Republic of Germany. To block German reunification, the Russians had created an East German state. The West would create a Western one. The new administration included many veteran fighters for German freedom. For those of them who had suffered for their beliefs in Nazi concentration camps, to be members of the first democratic government in their country for over 20 years was reward indeed. Here was the beginning of a new Germany. A realization of fact. The fact that several million industrious people, deprived for so long of democratic processes, could not continue without a government of their own choice. Taking the oath, the Chancellor of the new federal state, Konrad Adenauer.
Ich schwöre es, so wahr mir Gott helfe.
Then, in 1953, Joseph Stalin died. The shock throughout the communist world was profound. The workers were numbed and not a little troubled. Perhaps he'd been there so long that the world could never be the same without him. And this was to prove truer than most of them imagined. Now in the halls of government of Moscow, there was not just one face, but many. And for those in the West who were not experienced students of Russian politics, it was hard indeed to discern who, if any, held the real reins of power. Enough to say that though which way the cat might jump was anybody's guess, at any rate, general policy was unchanged. 1955. At a summit conference held in Geneva to try yet again to settle the thorny problems of divided Germany, the result was once again frustration. Faces from East and West might smile for the cameras, but in truth, this was merely putting a good face on failure. But though unity between the two halves of Germany might still be a long way off, the old Rhine was once again a true thoroughfare of Europe. That Europe which was now making its first faltering steps towards unity. By now, up the Rhine at Strasbourg, a Council of Europe was meeting regularly, and at its conferences, many European nations, NATO members and others, discussed their continent's future. The Council had no executive powers, and its members could only advise their governments of the general trend of its thinking. A good start, but no solutions. Yet, in fact, the solutions were easier than anyone imagined. Time didn't wait for a political solution. It was the needs of trade and a higher standard of living that began to destroy the walls. It started with iron and steel. Once, the Saar, the Ruhr, and Lorraine had been the crucibles of war. From them came the cannon of 1870, 1914, and 1939. There's the competition of Mars. Then, in one step, by one agreement, all were brought into the European community of coal and steel. The dream of France's foreign minister, Schuman, turned into reality. In 1952, in the city of Luxembourg, the community set up its headquarters. There, 6 Western European nations dealing in coal and steel cooperated to prevent overlapping, wasteful competition, and unrealistic prices, to establish in this field a common market, a phrase the world was to hear more of. Their reasons were purely economic, yet by this one act, a handful of practical men had done more for European unity than all the blood and force of centuries. Meanwhile, at NATO headquarters in Paris, equally significant moves had been made. By general agreement of all the NATO nations, the Federal Republic of Germany had been invited to sign the North Atlantic Treaty and thus to become their 15th ally. In 1955, this seemed merely a logical step, but in hindsight, it was a milestone of history. Henceforth, in the streets of Western German cities, there were still to be seen men and women in alien uniforms, but now they were there not as occupiers of a defeated state, but as allies to help safeguard the peace. A Western Germany within NATO made defense along the Iron Curtain a practical proposition. With growing Western strength, the old fears of infiltration and intimidation by the East were fast waning. Now millions upon millions, whose continent had given so much to the world, were free to get on with banishing need and want, to get on, in fact, with the real business of life. Now it would seem that the East was faced with a simple choice: risk another world war or talk terms across the conference table. So much for the first 10 years of the post-war world. Do you remember when Harry Lime sidled across Vienna's Prater to turn the scarcities of a war-ravaged city to his own profit? Well, Vienna is no longer that kind of city, and all that evokes that old Vienna is a musical memory. Today, in Western Europe, a Harry Lime would find meager scope. For now, in that prosperous and bustling continent, profiteering in vital necessities is not so easy. Now, in Vienna, Paris, and Rome, the Marshall Plan is so much a thing of the past that few can even recall it. How long ago is yesterday? Some of it, like Joseph Stalin, seems to be so far back as to be as dim as antiquity. The immediate yesterday, however, is still so close that to be reminded of it comes as a kind of shock. Rome, March 1957. A treaty signed by the 6 nations of the coal and steel community. Henceforth, it was to be the European Economic Community, or otherwise, the common market. But a common market, like Rome, is not built in a day. And even now, ordinary people who understand little of tariffs and quotas are less aware than they might be of the improving economic picture. But put it to them, and they will admit that things are far better than they were. For memories of the immediate yesterday on the political scene, let's begin in London. That city as conservative as, well, as only the City of London can be. And who were the Lord Mayor's guests of honor in the spring of '56? The state visitors from the Soviet Union were affectionately called Mr. B and Mr. K, or the Bulge and the Crush. Mr. B, Comrade Bulganin, and Mr. K, soon to prove the real power, Comrade Khrushchev. Faces smiled in keeping with a new policy termed peaceful coexistence. But behind lay a reality too grim for smiles. Across Germany sprawled a curtain, iron in fact as well as in name. Though leaders might sport in foreign capitals, for their people, peaceful coexistence was no more than a theory. November 1956, and Budapest is strewn with wreckage and corpses. A rising by Hungarians seeking minimal freedoms has been met by the clinching argument of tanks and guns. May 1960, and Mr. Khrushchev is to give a press conference. The place is Paris, where yet another summit meeting is disintegrating because of Soviet stonewalling. unwilling to continue discussions with the West, Mr. K is nonetheless keen to have an audience. Excellent copy that he is, the press likes Mr. K. And Mr. K likes them. But after the applause comes the rub. What was the use, he would like to know, of the Russians cooperating over the conference table when American planes were spying over the Soviet Union? In Moscow, he had the wreckage of a U-2, its special gear, and its pilot. Explain that, demands injured Mr. K.
И будете опять готовить нападение, мы так ухнем, что больше не будет шуток.
The U-2 has given Mr. Khrushchev his excuse to end a summit meeting that is embarrassing him and to take his leave. The next scene, New York, September 1962. The United Nations General Assembly. These were the days when this normally somewhat staid gathering was to be enlivened by Comrade Khrushchev. Because neither the Secretary General nor the Assembly at large would yield to Russian demands for a reorganization favoring the Soviet bloc, the Secretary General, Dag Hammarskjöld, was singled out for special treatment. But the Secretary General is not the only target, as British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan soon discovers. Like the charge of the Light Brigade, it is magnificent, but is it diplomacy? For millions of out-of-town visitors to New York, the United Nations building is but a tiny part of the great spectacle which is Manhattan. Here, amid all the symbols of wealth and power, foreign affairs are apt to seem as distant as though viewed through the wrong end of a telescope. A great nation, subject to no real threat of foreign invasion since the War of Independence. Imagine then the shock of the events of 1962. In the White House, a deeply disturbed President Kennedy consults with the Soviet Foreign Minister, Mr. Gromyko. Like a sudden nightmare, the world is faced with what seems to be inevitable nuclear warfare. Why this nightmare? And who is responsible? In the United Nations, a bearded, uniformed figure strides to the dais to deliver one of its long harangues against the United States. In this, there is nothing particularly new, neither in the form nor in the long-windedness. This is Fidel Castro of Cuba. What is new is that American photo reconnaissance planes flying over Cuba have supplied evidence of a series of rocket sites armed with Soviet weapons capable of subjecting the very heartland of the United States to close-range attack. An anxious United Nations Security Council listens to the United States representative, Mr. Adlai Stevenson.
We now know that the Soviet Union, not content with Dr. Castro's oath of fealty, not content with the destruction of Cuban independence, has decided to transform Cuba into a base for communist aggression, into a base for putting all of the Americas under the nuclear gun.
John Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev had once met in Vienna. Their meeting established a hotline. Now, when every minute counted, over that hotline, President Kennedy gave the choice. Not long afterwards, reconnaissance planes were able to report that ships sailing out of Cuba were carrying decked cargoes of rockets being returned to the Soviet Union. The world balance of power, which had been deliberately and dangerously tilted, was thus restored, thanks to the firmness of the American president. Can it be said that since the Cuban crisis, the good citizens of the United States have read the foreign news in their papers with just that shade more attention? What can be said is that they are now fully aware that the emphasis has swung away from the old political chessboard of Europe and onto the twin masses of themselves and the peoples of the Soviet Union. These days there are skyscrapers in Moscow, skyscrapers and drink dispensers and pre-packaging and telephones and television. In Moscow, the big store is called Gum. But inside, it's much like any other department store. Can this new consumer demand mean that in Russia today, materialism is infiltrating its decadent influence? In his tomb in Red Square, Lenin now lies alone. Comrade Stalin has been removed. Comrade Khrushchev, too, passed from the scene at the end of '64. As the Russians will tell you, it is not personalities that count, but policy. Now in the streets of Moscow, the people seem to have their eyes fixed on more distant targets, on the heavens, on the way to the stars. But the way to the stars lies also through the Brandenburg Gate. In Berlin, bricks, mortar, wire, and every kind of fiendish contraption make up what decent people call the wall of shame. Today, because the East maintains the uneasy status quo, Americans, British, and French must still patrol the wall they detest, just in case. On the other side, East German police work to make their defenses even more impregnable. Defenses designed not to keep out, but to keep in. Witness the memorials to those who tried to pass and failed. On this side of the wall, children play against its stones, as they will play anywhere. When Khrushchev was retired, 20 years after the Second World War, the young people of Europe inherited a divided Berlin, a divided Germany, and no final post-war settlement of the European problem. In the early 1960s, the means by which it was hoped such a settlement might be reached was called peaceful coexistence, a phrase first used by the East. In the late 60s, the West produced the single word détente to describe the policy, NATO's policy, of attempting by every possible political and diplomatic means to bridge the gaps between East and West, and by so doing to solve all the problems that beset Europe. This film stopped where it did because what happened after 1965 is not yet history, but still part of the Europe we live in today. A Europe of new ideas, of young people, many of whom never knew the hopes and the disappointments of those 20 years, those 2 decades, which future historians may well come to regard as a turning point in world history.